Chapter 2. All the summer through, Kristin thought of little else than what Simon had told her of her mother's death. Ravnsfrid Ivarsdatter had died all alone. None had been near when she drew her last breath, saving a serving woman who slept. 'Twas not much comfort what Simon said, that, though death came so suddenly, she was yet well prepared. It seemed like a special providence of God that, a few days before, she had felt in her such a hunger for her Redeemer's body that she had confessed and taken the sacrament from the priest in the cloister who was her director. 'Twas certain she had made a good death. Simon had seen her body and said it had seemed to him a marvellous sight. In death she had been so fair. She was, one knew, a woman near 80 years of age, and for many years her face had been much wrinkled and furrowed. But this was changed altogether. Her face was grown smooth and young, so that she looked like nothing else but a young woman fallen asleep. And now had she been laid to rest by her husband's side. Thither too had they brought Sigrid Lavransdatter's bones a short time after her father's death. Over the graves was laid a great stone slab, divided in two by a fairly carven cross, and on a winding scroll was written a long Latin verse that the prior of the cloister had made. But Simon could not remember it rightly, for he knew but little of that tongue. Ravnsfrid had had a house to herself in the yard up in the town, where the commoners of the cloister lived, a single room, and above it a fair loft room. There she dwelt alone with a poor peasant woman, who had been taken in by the friars for small payment, in return for her helping one or other of the richer women commoners. But for the last half-year at least, it had rather been Ravnsfrid who helped the other, for the widow, Thorgunna was her name, had been ailing, and Ravnsfrid tended her with a great kindness and care. The last evening of her life she had been at evensong in the cloister church, and went afterwards into the kitchen of the commoner's yard. There she cooked a good bowl of soup with strengthening herbs in it, and said to the other women who were there that she would give this to Thorgunna, and she hoped the woman would be well enough in the morning to come with her to matins. This was the last time any saw the Jorungard widow alive. They came not to matins, neither she nor the peasant woman, nor yet to prime. When some of the monks in the choir marked that Ravnsfrid was not in the church for the day mass either, they began to wonder. She had never before missed 3 services in a day. They sent word up to the town to ask if Lavrans Bjorgelsson widow were sick. When the folk came into the loft, they found the bowl of soup standing untouched on the board. In the bed, Thorgunna was sleeping sweetly by the wall, but Ravnsfrid Ivarsdatter lay on the outside of her bed, with her hands crossed on her breast, dead, and well nigh cold already. Simon and Ranborg had come down to her burial, and it was a most fair one. Now that the household at Huseby was grown so great, and Kristin had 6 sons, she could no longer take a hand herself in all parts of the housekeeping. She was obliged to have a housekeeper under her, and so it came about that most of the time the mistress of the house sat in the hall sewing. There was ever someone wanting clothes, Erland, Margaret, or the boys. The last time she had seen her mother was when they were riding after her husband's beer, that bright spring day when she had stood in the meadow at Jorungard, and seen her father's funeral train pass the green patch of winter rye beneath the scree. Kristin's needle flew, and she thought on her parents and their home at Jorengard. Now, when all was memory, she seemed to herself to grow aware of much she had not seen when she had lived in the midst of it, and took as things of course her father's tender guardianship, and her silent, sad-faced mother's quiet, constant work and care. She thought on her own children. They were dearer to her than her heart's own blood. They were not out of her mind 1 hour of her waking life. Yet there was much in her mind that she pondered over more. She loved her children without brooding on the matter. She had never thought anything else when she was at home, but that her parents' whole life and their doings and strivings were for herself and her sisters. Now she seemed to see that between these two, who in their youth had been brought together by their fathers, well nigh unasked, there had run strong, swift currents, both of sorrow and of joy. Yet she knew nothing of it, save that they had gone now, hand in hand, out of her life. Now she understood that Lavran's and Ranfrid's lives had held much beside their love for their children, and yet that love had been strong and wide and unfathomably deep, while the love she gave back to them had been weak and thoughtless and self-seeking, even when in her childhood those two had been her whole world. She seemed to see herself standing far, far away, so small beyond that great stretch of time and distance. She stood in the beam of sunlight that streamed down through the smoke vent in the old hearth-room at home, the winter house of her childhood. Her parents stood a little back in the shadow. They bulked as great as they had seemed to her sight when she was small, and they smiled to her. The smile that she knew now comes to one's face when a little child comes and thrusts aside heavy and troubling thoughts. I thought, Kristin, when you had borne a child yourself, you would surely understand better. She remembered when her mother had said these words. Sorrowfully, she thought that even now she did not understand her mother. But she began to realise how much there was she did not understand. This autumn Archbishop Eilif died, and about the same time King Magnus changed the terms of service of many of the wardens, but not Erland Nikolausson's. When Erland was in Bjorgvin the last summer of the king's nonage, he had been given letters granting him the 4th part of all grace payments, fines and forfeitures in his wardenship. The thing had made much talk that he should have been given such a grant toward the close of a regency. Since Erland now owned much land in the country, and most often lived on his own farms when he moved round his wardenship, and as he let his farmers redeem their land dues, his incomings were large. True, this meant that the incomings from land dues in kind were small, and he kept a great and costly train. Besides his own manor-folk, he never had fewer than 12 men-at-arms with him at Huseby. These were bravely mounted and exceedingly well armed, and when he moved about his charge, his men lived like lords. There was some talk of this one day when Lagmund Harald and Tor, the old warden of Galdola county, were at Huseby. Erland made answer that many of these men had been with him when he kept the marches in the north. And there we shared alike in such cheer as was to be had, dried fish and sour small beer. Now the men I give food and clothes to know that I grudge them not white bread and strong ale. And if now and then in a rage I bid them to go to hell, they understand well enough that I don't mean they should set forth before I lead the way myself. Ulf Haldarsson, who was the headman of Erland's guard now, said afterwards to his mistress that 'twas even so. Erland's men loved him, and he had them wholly in his hand. You know yourself, Kristin. No one should take much account of what Erland says. 'Tis what he does one must judge him by. Another matter that made much talk was that, besides his housecarls, Erland had men all about the countryside, and not in Orkdola county only, that he had sworn to his service on his sword hilt. Some time back he had received royal letters about this matter, but he had answered that these men had made up his ship's crew, and that he had taken oath from them the first spring when he was to sail for the north. Upon this it was enjoined upon him that he should loose these men from their oath at the next thing he held, to publish the judgments and decrees of the Lagthing, and that, to that end, he should summon thither the men from outside the county, bearing himself the costs of their journeys. And in truth he had sent for some of his old sailors from Moor to the Orkdal Thing, but no one heard anything of his having loosed them, or any other man who had been his follower, from their oaths. Howbeit the matter was not opened again, and so as the autumn passed, the talk about it died down. Late in the autumn Erland journeyed south and stayed over Yuletide at King Magnus' court, which was at Oslo that year. He was vexed that he could not bring his wife to go with him, but Kristin shrank from the toilsome winter journey and stayed on at home at Huseby. Erland came back 3 weeks after Yule, bringing fair gifts to his wife and all the children. He had given Kristin a silver bell to ring for her maids, but to Margaret he gave a clasp of pure gold, for she had nothing of the sort before, though she had many ornaments of every kind of silver and silver gilt. But while the women were putting away these costly gifts in their jewel chests, something in Margaret's chest caught on her sleeve and hung from it. The girl covered it up swiftly with her hand, saying to her stepmother, "'Twas my mother left me this, so father would prefer that I not show it to you." Kristin had flushed much redder than the maid. Her heart beat hard with fear, but it seemed to her that she must speak a word to the young girl to warn her. In a little she said in a low, faltering voice, "'Tis like the gold buckle that Lady Helgar of Gimsar used to wear at festivals." "Aye, many gold things are alike," answered the girl shortly. Kristin locked her chest and stood still with her hands resting on it, so that Margaret might not see how they shook. "My Margaret," she said softly and gently. She had to stop, but she gathered all her strength and went on. "My Margaret, bitterly have I repented. Never could I joy fully in any gladness, though my father forgave me with all his heart for all that I had sinned against him. You know that I sinned against my parents for your father's sake. But the longer I live, and the more I come to understand, the heavier it grows for me to remember that I repaid their goodness towards me by bringing them sorrow. My Margaret, your father has been good to you all the days of your life." "You need not be afraid, mother," answered the girl. "I am not your own daughter. You need not be afraid that I shall ever wear out your dirty shift, or stand in your shoes." Kristin turned a face flaming with wrath on her stepdaughter. Then she clutched the cross she wore about her neck tightly in her hand, and forced back the words that were on her lips. She went to Sira Eilif with this the same evening after Vespers, and she looked in vain in the priest's face for her sign. Had the worst befallen already, and did he know it? She remembered her own wildered youth, and she remembered Sira Eirik's face that betrayed nothing, while he lived day by day with her and her trusting parents, with her sinful secret locked in his bosom, and herself hard and dumb under his harsh threats and warnings. And she remembered the time after she had been lawfully betrothed to Erland, when she herself showed her mother the gifts he had given her at Oslo. The mother's face had been immovable in its calmness while she took these things in her hand, one by one, looked at them, praised them, and laid them away. She was in deadly, hopeless fear, and kept as wary a watch as she could on Margaret. Erland marked that there was something amiss with his wife, and one evening, when they had gone to rest, he asked if it was that she was with child again. Kristin lay silent for a little before she answered that she believed it was so. And when her husband on this took her lovingly in his arms and asked no more, she could not bring herself to say that 'twas something else that was weighing on her. But when Erland whispered to her that this time she must do her devoir and give him a daughter, she had no power to answer, but lay there stiff with dread, thinking that Erland might come to know all too soon what kind of joy a man has of his daughters. Some nights after this, the folk at Huseby had gone to bed somewhat in drink and heavy with much eating, for it was in the last days before the fast began, and thus all slept heavily. But well on in the night little Lavrans woke in his parents' bed, and still half asleep began to whimper and cry for his mother's breast. But the time had now come for him to be weaned. Erland woke up, grunted angrily, but took the boy and gave him milk from a cup that stood on the bedstep, and laid him down then at his other side. Kristin had sunk again in deep drowsiness, when of a sudden she felt Erland sit upright in the bed. Half awake, she asked what it was. He bade her hush, in a voice she did not know. Without a sound he slipped out of the bed. She marked that he was putting on some pieces of clothing, but when she raised herself on her elbow, he pressed her down again on the cushions with one hand, while he leant in above her and took his sword that hung above the bedhead. He moved as silently as a lynx, but she felt that he had gone off to the ladder that led up to Margaret's bower above the outer room. For a moment she lay palsied with dread. Then she sat up, found her shift and skirt, and groped in the dark for her shoes on the floor by the bed. At the same moment a woman's shriek rang out from the loft room. It must have been heard over the whole manor. Erland's voice shouted a word or two. Then she heard the ring of clashing swords and the trampling of feet above. Then the noise of a weapon falling on the floor and a shriek of terror from Margaret. Kristin knelt crouching by the hearth, raked away the hot ashes with her bare hands, and blew on the embers. When she had gotten the fir-root torch alight and held it up in her shaking hands, she saw Erland high up in the darkness. He leapt down without heeding the ladder, bearing his naked sword in his hands, and ran out of the outer door. From every side in the darkness the boys' heads peeped out. She went to the northern bed where the three elders slept, bade them lie down, and shut the bed door. Ivar and Skule, who sat up on the bench where their beds had been made, blinking in fear and bewilderment at the light, she made creep into her own bed and shut them in too. Then she lighted a candle and went out into the courtyard. It was raining, and for one moment, while the light of her candle was mirrored in the wet shining ice crust, she saw a crowd of folk outside the door of the nearest house, the servants' quarter, where Erland's housecarls slept. Then her light was blown out. For a moment 'twas pitch-black night, but then Ulf Haldorsson came from the servants' quarter bearing a lantern. He bent down over a dark body that lay in a huddled heap on the wet, lumpy ice. Kristin knelt down and felt the man's body with her hands. 'Twas young Hakon of Gimsar, and he was swooning or dead. Straightway her hands were covered with blood. Helped by Ulf, she turned and straightened out the body. The blood was gushing from the right arm, from which the hand had been cut off. Unawares she cast a glance upward to where the shutter of the window-hole of Margaret's bower was clapping in the wind. She could not see any face up there, but 'twas exceeding dark. While she knelt in the puddles, pressing Hakon's wrist with all her might to stop the gush of blood, she was dimly aware of Erland's men standing around, half-clad. Then she saw Erlend's grey, writhen face. With the skirt of his mantle he was wiping his bloody sword. He was naked beneath, and his feet were bare. "One of you, find me a band," she said. "And you, Bjorn, go up and wake Sigrid Eilif. We must bear him up to the priest's house." She took the leather strap that someone handed to her and wound it tight around the stump of the arm. Of a sudden Erlend said, in a wild, hard voice, "Let none touch him. Let the man lie where he fell." "You know well, husband," said Kristin calmly, though her heart was beating nigh to choking her, that cannot be." Erlend thrust the sword point hard into the ground. "Your flesh and blood she is not. I have been made to understand that all these years." Kristin stood up and whispered quietly to him. "Yet I would much prefer, for her sake, that this should be hidden, if it can be. You men," she turned to the men that stood about, "you are true enough to your master, I think, not to speak of this, till he has told you all of how this strife between Hakon and himself came about?" All the men agreed. One of them dared step forward and explained. They had been awakened by the sound of a woman screaming, as if she were being taken by force. And then someone ran along their roof, but he must have slipped on the icy surface. They heard a scrambling noise and then a thud on the ground. But Kristin told the man to be silent. At that moment Sigrid Eilif came running. When Erlend turned and went in, his wife ran after him, trying to thrust past him. When he made for the loft ladder, she got in front of him and caught him round the arms. "Erlend, what would you do with the child?" she gasped out into his grey, wild face. He made no answer. He tried to fling her aside, but she held fast to him. "Erlend, stay, stay! She is your child! You don't know! The man was fully clad!" she cried despairingly. He gave a loud hoarse cry before answering, and she grew deathly white with horror. His words were so gross and his voice so changed by his wild agony. Again she wrestled dumbly with the raging man that growled and gnashed his teeth together. At last she caught his eyes in the half-light. "Erlend, let me go to her first. I have not forgotten the day when I was no better than Margaret." Then he loosed her, and, staggering back against the closet wall, stood there quivering like a dying beast. Kristin went and lit a candle, then came back and went past him up to Margaret in her bower. The first thing the light fell on was a sword that lay on the floor not far from the bed, and close by a man's severed hand. Kristin tore off her headdress, which, hardly knowing it, she had flung loosely round her flowing hair before she went out to the men. Now she threw it over those things lying on the floor. Margaret sat huddled together on the pillows of the bedhead, gazing at Kristin's light with great, wide-open eyes. She held the bedclothes up about her, but her naked shoulders shone white through the golden locks of her hair. There was much blood all about the room. The strain of Kristin's spirit burst out in a vehement fit of weeping. 'Twas so miserable a sight to see the fair child in the middle of all this horror. Then Margaret shrieked aloud, "Mother, what will father do with me?" Kristin could not help it. In the midst of her deep pity for the girl, her heart seemed to grow small and hard in her breast. Margaret had not asked what her father had done with Hakon. In a flash it came to her, Erlend lying on the ground, her father standing over him with a bloody sword, and she herself. Margaret had not moved from the spot. She could not hinder the old scornful dislike for Elene's daughter from coming up in her again, as Margaret clung to her, shaking, well nigh crazy with fear. She sat down on the bed's edge and strove to quiet the child a little. So they sat when Erland came up through the trapdoor. He was fully clad now. Margaret shrieked again and hid in her stepmother's arms. Kristin looked up at her husband for a moment. He was calm now, but pale and strange of face. For the first time he looked as old as he was. But when he said quietly, "You must go down now, Kristin. I wish to speak to my daughter alone," she obeyed. She laid the girl down in the bed carefully, covered her up to the chin with the clothes, and then went down the ladder. As Erland had done, she dressed herself fully. 'Twas certain none at Huseby would sleep any more that night, and she set herself to quiet the frightened children and serving women. The next morning, in a driving snowstorm, Margaret's maid was sent weeping off the place with all her worldly goods in a sack on her back. Her master had driven her out with the direst words and threats that she should be flayed alive because she had sold her mistress thus. Then he put the rest of the serving folk to the question. Didn't the maids suspect anything when Ingalive in the autumn and winter had begun sleeping with them instead of in Margaret's bower? And how came it that the dogs had been locked inside their house? But they denied everything, as was only to be expected. Last of all he took his wife to task, they two alone. Heartsick and weary, Kristin listened to him and strove to turn aside his injustice with soft answers. She didn't deny that she had been fearful, but she refrained from saying she had not spoken to him of her fear because she had never gained anything but unthankfulness from him when she had tried to counsel either him or Margaret for the maid's good. But she swore by God and Mary Virgin that she had never known, nor could have thought, such a thing as that this man came to Margaret in the loft at night. "You," said Erland scornfully. "You say yourself you mind the time when you were no better than Margaret. And Lord God in heaven knows that you had let me mark every day of the years we have lived together that you remembered the wrong I did you. Though your will was as good as mine, and your father, and not I, caused much of the trouble, by denying to let you wed me. I was willing enough from the first hour to make amends for the sin. When you saw the Gimsar gold—" He gripped her hand tightly and held it up, so that the 2 rings she had had of him at Gerderud glittered in the light. "Didn't you know what it meant? You have worn every day in these years the rings I gave you when you gave me your honour." Kristin was ready to sink down with weariness and sorrow. She answered in a low voice, "I marvel, Erland, if you still remember the time you overcame my honour." He buried his head in his arms and flung himself down on the bench, tossing and writhing. Kristin sat down a little way off. She wished she could help her husband. She understood that this calamity fell yet more hardly upon him, because he himself had sinned against others in the same way as now he had been sinned against. And he, who had never been willing to look his fault in the face in any trouble he himself had caused, could never bear to take the blame for this. And there was no one else but she whom he could blame. But she was not so much angered as sorrowful and fearful of what now might come to pass. Now and again she was upstairs with Margaret. The girl lay white and unmoving, staring before her. She had not yet asked what had befallen Hakon. Kristin knew not whether 'twas that she dared not, or that she was quite dulled by her own misery. Well on in the afternoon, Kristin saw Erland and Klong, the Icelander, going together through the thick falling snow to the armoury. But a short time passed, and Erland came back alone. Kristin looked up a moment as he came into the light and passed by her. Afterward, she did not dare turn her eyes toward the corner of the hall where he had hid himself away. She had seen that he was quite broken. Soon after, when she had an errand over at the storehouse, Ivar and Skule came running and told their mother that Clong the Icelander was going away that evening. The boys were sad about it, for the clerk was a good friend of theirs. He was packing his things now, and was to go down to Bergsea tonight. She had guessed already what must have happened. Erland had offered his daughter to the clerk, and he had refused to have a fallen maid. But what that parley must have meant to Erland! She grew sick and dizzy and could not bear to think the thought out. The day after, word came from the priest's house. Hakon Eidridsson prayed that he might have speech with Erland. Erland sent back in answer that he had nothing more to say to Hakon. Sara Eilif said to Kristin that if Hakon lived, he would be completely crippled. Besides that he'd lost his right hand, he had hurt his back and hips badly in falling from the roof of the servant's house. But he was set on coming home even as he was, and the priest had promised to get him a sleigh. He repented his sin now with all his heart. He said that Margaret's father had been within his rights, however the law might stand. But he was most fain that all should do their best to hush up the matter, so that his misdeed and Margaret's shame should be hidden as much as might be. In the afternoon he was borne out to the sleigh which Sara Eilif had borrowed from Repstadt, and the priest himself rode with him to Galdal. So it was the next day, which was Ash Wednesday, the Huseby folk had to go down to Vinjar, to the parish church. But at the time of Vespers, Kristin had the acolyte let her into the chapel at home. She could feel the ashes still on her forehead when she knelt down by her stepson's grave and said over the paternosters for his soul. Not much but bones would be left of the boy now, down under his stone. Bones and the hair, and some shreds of the clothes they had been laid in. She had seen the bones of her little sister when they took her up that they might bring her to her father at Hamar. Dust and ashes. She thought of her father's comely face, of her mother with the great eyes in the furrowed face, and the form that still kept so strangely young and slim and light, though her face grew old so early. There they lay under a stone, falling apart, as houses fall to ruin when the folks that lived there are gone. Pictures flitted and faded. The burned ruins of the church at home. A farm at Silsedal that they used to ride by when they went to Varg. The houses stood empty and were falling in pieces. The folk that tilled the lands dared not go near them after the sun was down. She thought upon her beloved dead, their looks and their voices, and smiles and ways and bearing, now that they themselves were gone away to yonder other country. To think on their shapes was sore. 'Twas like remembering one's home when one knew that it stood desolate and the rotting timbers were sinking into the soil. She sat on the wall bench in the empty church, and the smell of cold, stale incense held her thoughts fast bound to pictures of death and the decay of all earthly things. And she was powerless to lift up her soul to see a glimpse of the land where her beloved were, whither all goodness and love and truth at last were taken away and there treasured up. Every day when she prayed for the peace of their souls, it seemed to her strange and unfair that she should pray for them whose souls already on this earth had possessed a peace far deeper than she had ever known since she grew to be a woman. Sara Eilif, indeed, said that prayer for the dead was always good for oneself, even if those others were already inheritors of God's peace. But it didn't help her. It seemed to her that when her weary body at last was rotting under a tombstone, her restless spirit would still be doomed to wander about somewhere nearby, as an unhappy ghost wanders lamenting round the tumble-down houses of a ruined farm. For in her soul sin still had its being, as the root tissue of weeds is inwoven in the soil. It flowered and flamed and scented the air no longer, but 'twas still there in the soil, bleached, but strong and full of life. In despite of all the tenderness that welled up in her heart when she saw her husband's despair, she had not the will or strength to stifle the voice in her that cried out in bitterness and anger, "Can you speak thus to me? Have you forgotten the time when I gave you my troth and my honour? Have you forgotten the time when I was your dearest love?" And yet she knew that as long as this voice questioned thus within her, so long would she speak to him as though she had forgotten. She flung herself in her thoughts before St. Olaf's shrine, caught at the mouldering bones of Brother Edmund's hand far off in the church at Vatsfjeld. She clenched her hands about the reliquaries with the shreds of a dead woman's shroud and the splinters of the bones of an unknown blood witness, caught for a safeguard at the small remains that through death and nothingness had kept a little of the virtue of the departed soul, like the magic power that clings about the rust-eaten swords dug up from ancient warriors' barrows. The day after, Erland rode into the city, taking with him only Ulf and one other man. All through the fast time he didn't come home to Huseby, but Ulf came to fetch his bodyguard and took them to meet him at the mid-fast thing at Orkadal. In talk with Kristin alone, Ulf had told her that Erland had agreed with Tidekin Paus, the German goldsmith at Nidaros, that Margaret should wed Tidekin's son Gerlach as soon as Easter was past. Erland came home at Easter. He was quiet and calm now, but Kristin thought she could see that he would not be able to shake this off as he had shaken off so much else. Whether it was because he was no longer so young, or because nothing before had ever humbled him so deeply. Margaret seemed quite heedless how her father was ordering things for her. But one evening, when husband and wife were alone, Erland said, "Had she been my true-born child, or her mother an unwed woman, never would I have given her to a stranger while things are so with me. I could have sheltered and guarded both her and hers. This is an ugly way out, but seeing what her birth is, a wedded husband can best safeguard her." While Kristin was making all ready for her stepdaughter's going, Erland said one day curtly, "Perhaps you are scarce well enough to go with us to the city." "If you wish it, you know that I will go," said Kristin. "Why should I wish it? Since up to now you have never stood in a mother's place for her, there is no need you should do so now, and a joyous wedding 'twill not be. Lady Gunnar of Rasvold and her son's wife have promised to come for our kinship's sake." So Kristin stayed at Huseby, while at Nidaros Erland gave his daughter to Gerlach Tidekin's son.